Good evening again from New York, and good early morning to all our friends in Asia. I'm Tom Nagorski, Executive Vice President of the Asia Society. Welcome back to the Asia 21 Summit, our first ever virtual edition of this great annual gathering of the Asia 21 Young Leaders Network. And what a great 48 hours this has been. Hard really to recap and review everything. We have covered so many areas and issues that fall under our thematic heading, Life After the Pandemic. Great thanks to the Asia 21 local chapters and our Asia Society centers who have led, sorry, we have a little reverb here, who have led sessions throughout the past couple of days. We move now to our last few hours of the summit, in which we will feature conversations about arts and culture, about technology and innovation, about mindfulness, and at the close, we'll bring in our Asia 21 and Asia Society friends in Tokyo, where we plan to gather 1 year from now, public health permitting, for the Asia 21 Summit in Tokyo, the 2021 edition. But to get us started tonight, we take a deep dive into what may be one of the biggest sea changes that we've seen in the wake of COVID, and that is in the field of global education, and what may be the lasting impact of the disruption we have seen during this really disruptive year. To get this conversation going, two major figures in the field of global education. Sal Khan, as most of you know, is a pioneer in global online education, a trailblazer, CEO of the Khan Academy, which he founded in 2005, a nonprofit educational organization that offers free lessons in math, science, and the humanities in multiple languages, as well as free tools for parents and educators to track student progress. He did it initially to help his cousins, and now he and the Academy help hundreds of millions of children and educators all over the world. And speaking of education, Sal Khan holds 3 degrees from MIT and an MBA from Harvard. Also with us for this session, my colleague Tony Jackson, who's Vice President for Education at the Asia Society and Director of our Center for Global Education. That's a platform for collaboratively advancing education for global competence. Tony Jackson is one of the nation's leading experts on secondary school education reform and adolescent development. Before coming to the Asia Society, Tony Jackson directed the Carnegie Corporation's task force on the education of young adolescents, which produced a groundbreaking report called Turning Points, Educating Adolescents in the 21st Century. Now, how this will go, Sal Khan's going to deliver opening remarks. Tony Jackson will lead a conversation with him. And then we'll bring in, as we have done throughout this summit, a couple of Asia 21 alums who have deep experience in this area, very different experience. Clarissa Delgado, Asia 21 class of 2016. She's the co-founder and CEO of Teach for the Philippines. Teach for the Philippines, formerly known as Saaklat Sisikat, pardon my pronunciation, has been a partner of the Department of Education in the Philippines since 1999. Clarissa is not only an Asia 21 alum, she's a member of the inaugural 2018 class of Obama Foundation Fellows. And Wenchi Yu, Asia 21 class of 2011, she's an Ash Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and the head of global public policy at VIPKid, the world's leading education technology platform company. She leads their public policy and social impact initiatives, including the establishment of VIPteach.org, a not-for-profit organization seed-funded and incubated to promote equitable access to quality education through technology. Before that, Wenchi was head of corporate engagement for Goldman Sachs in Asia, which is where she was when we first met her, where she led strategic philanthropy for stakeholder engagement and social impact in Asia. And as always, we will take questions. Tony Jackson will, from the wonderful group that's watching here in the US, and in, we think it's up over 40 countries now joining us for the Asia 21 Summit, all over Asia and the world. But to get us started, as I said, Sal Khan, founder, CEO of the Khan Academy, it's great to have you with us at the Asia Society and at this summit. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. And one thing I'll say, we'll probably talk a lot more about this, but one of our main points of advice has been that when you're on video conference, it should be as interactive as possible. So I don't want to be a hypocrite, but I will start with a few words just to lay the foundation, and then we'll hopefully have a good conversation after that. One of our main points of advice. So as was introduced, Khan Academy, we're not-for-profit, mission-free, world-class education for anyone, anywhere. As Tom introduced, it started with the tutoring family back in a long time ago. One cousin initially, word spread in my family, multiple cousins. You fast forward to earlier this year, before the pandemic had hit most of us fully, and we had about 100 million registered users. Tens of millions of kids around the world were coming on a monthly basis. And we've always had kind of three pillars to what we were doing, even before COVID. One was, can we make the world's core academic material available to everyone for free in the most accessible way possible, from pre-K through elementary, middle, high school, and even the core of college. The second pillar is, how do we make that as engaging as possible? And a sub-pillar there can we use personalization? Personalization of pace. Every teacher would tell you that in a class of 30, all of the students are ready to go at different paces. Also personalization in terms of different needs, different gaps. Most teachers will also tell you that in a room of 30, those 30 kids have different gaps. But in a traditional academic setting, it's very hard to address those gaps. And I'll double click on that second pillar, because what typically happens globally is kids get a 90%, 80%, 70% on one unit, one concept. And even though the assessment has identified gaps, a 10% gap, a 20% gap, a 30% gap, the class will then move on to the next concept. And especially in concepts in subjects like mathematics, the next concept is likely going to build on those gaps, somehow expecting you to understand fractions even though you haven't mastered multiplication yet, somehow expecting you to master algebra even though you might not have mastered exponents or decimals yet. And we know how that leads, and we could talk more about what happens once kids get into high school or early college. They really do hit a wall. They have to get significant remediation, and that is probably the biggest gating factor for a lot of kids to succeed, especially kids from historically under-resourced groups globally. And then the last pillar, and this is all related, is how do you take that learning and how do you connect it with opportunity? And we've always talked about going to kind of a competency-based world where it's not how long did you spend in a chair to get the credit. It should be, do you know the material or not? And if you know the material, we don't care if it took you 2 weeks or took you 2 years. And if you don't know the material, keep working on it. So those have always been the three pillars. You fast forward to actually February of 2020. It feels like a lifetime ago. And we start seeing our traffic pick up in Asia in particular. I remember getting a letter from a teacher in South Korea telling us how they were using Khan Academy to get them through their physical school closures. And that was the first time it dawned on me that, one, countries were shutting down schools physically, and that, two, it became pretty obvious that we were very relevant in this because we were accessible, we're available in over 46 languages, we're standards aligned, we're able to be used in a classroom setting with teacher tools, but we're also very accessible by families and students on their own. We cover multiple subjects and grades. And so you could imagine by early March, when it became clear that it wasn't just an Asian phenomenon, that it was going to become a global phenomenon, including the US, that you're going to have physical school shutdowns. It was one of those moments where all of us at Khan Academy, we kind of looked left, looked right, and said, I think this is us. and so we kind of got a war room situation going. We made sure our servers could handle more load. We started planning training webinars for parents and teachers. We started putting out lesson plans on how you could do distance learning, daily schedules, et cetera, et cetera. It was also obvious that it was going to last longer than probably most people at the time were talking about. We all know now it's likely to last well into next year as well. And so we were all in. By third week of March, we were seeing about 300% of normal traffic. Our parent and teacher registrations were 10 to 20 times normal. And we've just been trying to keep up with that ever since. We've been accelerating more content that could be useful, especially content that could help teachers assess where kids are and fill in gaps. Independently of Khan Academy, but very complementary, Khan Academy, a lot of folks were leaning on it for the asynchronous part of learning, to get the practice, to get video instruction, things like that. But it also became clear that there was a gap in live synchronous interaction, and most kids weren't getting it the way they should. And one of my dreams for Khan Academy has always been, it shouldn't just be a place where people learn from the software or the computer. It should also be a place where they can connect with other people. And so I actually started a new not-for-profit because of COVID, very complementary to Khan Academy. Maybe one day they converge back together, to offer free tutoring to any student who needs free tutoring. And the way it works is called schoolhouse.world. We actually have capacity for several thousands of more students if any of y'all want some tutoring. But the way it is high quality vetted tutors volunteer their time, and students can then show what they need help in. It's the same taxonomy as Khan Academy. And then the tutors can schedule the sessions. There's a rating mechanism there. Adding to that, another interesting thing that has happened, and several thousand people are already using it. We're going to do a massive launch there in January. But there's an interesting element to the schoolhouse.world and Khan Academy that's related to the third pillar of Khan Academy, which is connecting to opportunity. The University of Chicago announced a few months ago that they were going to use students' ability to certify their knowledge and also be great tutors on Schoolhouse, leveraging Khan Academy, for college admissions. So it's kind of connecting all of the pieces of learning at your own time and pace, being able to master concepts, being able to get certified in that mastery through a community, being able to get help through a community, and that if you're able to contribute to the community, then in this case, higher education, and I'm hoping also employers will look at that as, wow, it's nice to see the student who's mastered a concept. It's even nicer to see the student who can teach the concept, because it means they clearly have subject mastery, but they also have empathy and strong communication skills. So that's where we roughly are now. I'll just end with two disclaimers. A lot of folks, I'm kind of the poster child for online learning, but if I had to pick between a in-person physical teacher and the best technology, distance learning, whatever, I would pick the in-person physical teacher every time. So in my head, it's always, what are the pedagogical things we want to solve? And then what are the tools we're trying to solve for? And for me is, how do you allow people to do mastery learning? How do you allow personalization to happen at scale, ideally with a teacher, but we know there's large parts of the world where they don't have access to a course or a teacher. How do we get personalized learning there as well? And then how do you connect to opportunity? And so that's where the technology should always be in service to that. So with that, I'll stop talking.
And I will start talking if I can unmute myself. Great, Sal. Thanks so much. That was terrific. I really, really appreciate it. You gave us a lot to think about to start with. And I want to pick up on some of the themes that you've already started with. And I want to actually harken back to both what you already touched on, but a piece you wrote in the New York Times, an op-ed from earlier in the spring, where you said, if educators and families aren't empowered with the right support and tools, this will evolve from an education crisis to an education catastrophe. And then you also said, I've been working with teachers over the last several months, and together we've realized that the lesson plans designed for in-person classes don't work in the coronavirus world. They fall short in terms of the social emotional experience that schools should provide. So I first just want to ask you and get your take on kind of the situation we are living in now. I mean, as you mentioned, we're sort of going into the second full year of online learning predominantly within our schools. And here in Los Angeles, where I am, they just announced today that they're on online learning for the foreseeable future. So have we moved, thinking about what that experience has been like for kids, have we moved from a crisis to a catastrophe? Has there been lasting harm? And then a second kind of question related to what you were mentioning. You mentioned that it's difficult sometimes to translate in-class lessons because of the inability to kind of reach the social emotional capacities of young people. But can you do that in online learning? And if so, how? So let me just start with those questions.
Yeah. So on the first, whether we're in a crisis or a catastrophe, it's a mixture. I think, if you kind of segment, and I think this is true generally, I mean, the proportions might be different depending on what country you look at. But generally speaking, there's about 60% of the population that have internet access, that have the supports at home, that are staying engaged with whatever distance learning they're getting, and they're doing okay. If anything, the data is that some middle class, upper middle class families, they're learning just as much, in some cases even accelerating because they're getting more supports, and it's more customized to their needs right now. But even there, even on that 60, 70%, even if the academics are on track or even better than expected, it's still suboptimal because those kids are missing out on significant social emotional learning that you don't see it assessed, but we all know, reflecting on our own development,
Sure,
that a lot of that happens in a physical setting. Then if you look at the other 30 or 40%, I think it's between a crisis and a catastrophe. A lot of places have done great efforts bridging the digital divide, although it has not been bridged yet. So those kids have not been able to engage. And even where the digital divide has been bridged, there's 5 to 10% of students that are just lost right now. One of my neighbors is a school teacher, 5th grade school teacher. I live in a upper middle class neighborhood. And she tells me, and I was surprised because it's in the middle of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Google is, 4 miles down the road. Khan Academy is 1 mile down the road. that 5 to 10% of her students have disappeared. And this is not a under-resourced area. And she just doesn't even know how to reach them. And those numbers are higher in more under-resourced areas. And so those kids I worry the most about, because those are the kids that were already on the edge, already on the fringes of kind of falling off. And I suspect that unless there's a more proactive intervention there, they're going to fall off or they've already fallen off. And so as we go back to normal, which, as you mentioned, is probably not going to be until next school year.
Yeah.
I think there's going to have to be double down effort on being able to remediate folks, being able to give people pathways so that they can get back into the system, instead of just saying, okay, now just go to the next grade and just try to go with the flow. That's not going to work. And unfortunately, I think a lot of these kids are going to drop out, especially those kids who might have already been 15, 16, 17, kind of on the cusp.
Yep.
That's where it's even more important to have these competency-based mechanisms to come back into the system, which has always been important. There's always 20 or 30% of the kids that are kind of fall out of the system, even in wealthy countries. You need to give them mechanisms to re-engage with the system without having a stigma associated with it. In terms of the second question around social emotional learning, the tough thing, I think, is obvious to everyone. When kids are on Zoom, they might be on other windows. You can't even force them to show up. We talked about the 5-10% problem. But the good thing is we've seen teachers and educators have really good conversations. They're like, okay, over Zoom, you can't just lecture. If it's a lecture or a video conference, it might as well be a video. It's much better to pull kids out of the screen, cold call on them, ask them questions, put them into breakout rooms, make them interact with each other every 15, 20 minutes, give them a bit of a change of scenery, give them something to connect with each other on. And the silver lining, everything that people are now realizing you have to do on video conference, those are actually best practices
Exactly.
when you're in a physical setting as well.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many classrooms growing up you sit in and it's like fingers on your lips, 30 kids are there. You kind of have to be there physically, but mentally you're someplace else.
Yeah.
Ideally, in a real classroom, you're put into breakouts, you're peer tutoring, you're able to talk to each other, and you're able to ask questions of the teacher, and the teacher is asking questions of you. So I'm hoping that we see more of that, and that it actually pays dividends beyond just the distance learning.
Yeah. Let me just follow up real quick on there's a real danger of me getting into wonky education stuff, but nevertheless, I do want to kind of come back to what you mentioned around competency-based learning and how that might be a way to get kids back into the game if they've fallen off the track, as it were. Can you say a bit more about what that looks like and where you've seen that actually kind of work well?
Yeah, so, just to reiterate for folks who aren't familiar, there's traditional learning, which you could call seat time learning. You sit in a chair and you, for the most part, do what you're told. And even if you kind of do what you're told, you'll get a C in most cases, and you'll pass, and then you move on to the next thing. Now, the next thing, you have significant gaps if you have a C or a D, but then you'll kind of go through the motions of the next thing. It'll be that much harder, but if you kind of scrape by with a C or a D, you'll pass, and eventually you could get a high school diploma, or if you keep doing that, you could even get a college diploma by getting a bunch of C's or D's. But at the end of that whole experience, you really don't know what the student knows or doesn't know. I would argue even A students, you really don't know what they know or don't know. I think most of us, would have trouble listing the classes we took, much less the actual content of it after high school or after college. Competency-based learning is the other way. We don't care how you got there, how long it took you, how old you are. Do you know it or do you not know it? And if you don't know it yet, not a big deal. We're not going to judge you. There's ways for you to keep trying to know it. And intellectually, I think, it's hard to disagree with competency-based learning. What has been harder is how do you implement it?
Yeah.
Because what it means is you have to have rigorous, thoughtful, standardized assessments to measure competency. And not only do you have to have the assessments, but you essentially have to have multiple shots at the assessment. And in theory, you need to allow kids to learn at different times and paces. And in a traditional environment, both of those things are very hard. If I'm if it's just me in a classroom of 30 of kids, no matter how hard I try as a teacher, it's very hard to teach to 30 different kids individually to their individual needs and paces. And it's also very hard for me to develop an assessment for those 5 kids that are ready. Maybe 3 of them show competency, 2 of them don't. They have to take a different assessment that have to rewrite and regrade next week. That's impossible. And so that's where the technology component comes into it. There's actually been policymakers, the state of New Hampshire in the United States, most famously, has in law put a competency-based system for at least their high school system. Now, even there, what's been hard is it's been hard for teachers to personalize and to do the assessment. Mm-hmm. But I think the world we're getting into, this combination of Khan Academy and schoolhouse.world, I think is really interesting. What we're doing is kids can obviously work on Khan Academy, show mastery there. They can get extra help through schoolhouse tutoring. And that once they feel that they know the material, we have functionally infinite assessments on Khan Academy. And so they can take a unit test, they can take a course challenge, they record themselves while they're doing it. We have a tool for them to do that. They talk out loud to explain their reasoning while they're taking the assessment. If they cross the 90% threshold, they submit that video to the schoolhouse community. 2 members of the schoolhouse community will review that video, make sure that no cheating was involved. They definitely were able to explain their reasoning. And if they are, give them a thumbs up on their profile, say, yep, they've shown mastery in that unit of, say, algebra or that unit of calculus. And now, 1, they're ready to teach that material. So that's even the next level of certification. But also, they know their stuff. And that's the type of thing that University of Chicago is interested in. And I'm very energized behind looking at how we can actually give kids credit for that. You can imagine if you can show mastery on Khan Academy in, say, Algebra 2 or college algebra, pre-calc or biology or chemistry, I think you should get credit for that at the high school and the college level. And especially if you're able to tutor it. If you're able to tutor these subjects, you for sure, I would put you against any student who gets an A pretty much anywhere, and I would say you're at least as good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. I want to bring in Wenchi and Clarissa in just a second, but I just had actually one quick question, and I'm going to sort of take it to a different level, but I want to get this in, and then maybe actually Clarissa and Wenchi might want to comment on this as well. But as you may have heard, we're going to have a change of administration soon. Well, actually, let me check my phone just to see if there's been any. No, we're good. We're good. Yeah. So we're going to have a change of administration, and as you know, as Tom mentioned, you're a luminary in the field. It's entirely possible that Joe Biden calls Sal Khan and says, Sal, what should be my priorities with regard to educational policy as we go forward? I mean, what should I really invest in and spend time on that really would make a game-changing kind of change in the situation with regard to technology or anything else? But what's your take on what the priority should be for education policy going forward?
Yeah, I think there's 3 or 4 layers to that. First and foremost, digital divide. Close that digital divide as quickly as possible. It seems like a no-brainer. I haven't seen anyone argue against it on either political side. We're doing $1 trillion of stimulus here and there. Completely closing the digital divide, depending on the numbers I've seen, are anywhere between 20 to 100 billion. It would have huge benefit, not just on education, but in people's ability to participate in the economy generally. It would unlock a lot. So that's the most obvious one. The second one is, and I think this would be a big win for any administration, regardless of their political angle, is just tell the country, hey, we're going to make sure that every child in the country has access to personalized support to reach their potential. So we've partnered with Khan Academy and others, but to get all your personalized support, and there's free tutoring for you. I mean, people say free tutoring, that's incredible. And it could be volunteer driven or I think part of these stimulus packages, they're going to want to put a lot of people to work. So in some of these kind of people are talking about a WPA part 2. Also ways that maybe you could pay recent college grads or college students who are trying to do work study, or even high school students whose families make below a certain income, to also get paid by the government to then tutor other folks, because we know that it's really going to be a disaster recovery. There's going to be a lot of kids, especially kids in that bottom quartile of income and access, who are going to need fundamentally personalized support right now. And that's going to come through software, through videos, and through person-to-person connection. The third layer, I would say, is create a competency-based model where we signal to everyone in America and higher education and industry, hey, we're going to make a thing. that if you can show competency in this way, not only is that good enough to go to college, but employers, and here's a list of employers that will interview you, will give you, will get you apprenticeships. And then I would say maybe if I were to add a fourth, it would be some teacher professional development to help them up level those skills on all of the dimensions we just talked about.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, and I was thinking that all of that is at some level going to require teacher professional learning. But everything you said makes a ton of sense. Let me then come into bring in Wenchi and Clarissa to our conversation. And maybe I'll start with you, Wenchi. And I wonder if you could just start us off by saying a little bit about what VIPKid actually does, but then particularly since you are, and I want to kind of follow the policy angle for a second, could you say a bit more about your take on innovative ways that government and the private sector can work together to kind of find solutions to some of these issues that Sal was mentioning, the digital gap, for example, and how can government policies enable better and more equitable learning online for all kids? So, Wenchi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. First of all, just wanted to thank Asia 21 for inviting me to share this panel with Sal in particular and Tony, who are really pioneers in education. I feel really honored. And of course, Clarissa's work to bridge the learning gap. So VIPKid is a for-profit, a global education technology company that we connect children with teachers for real-time online education. It's actually tutoring. So I would love to, discuss with Khan Academy how we can actually work together to provide tutoring opportunity. So we are founded by Cindy Me, a women entrepreneur, in 2013. And Cindy's vision is to have a global classroom that empowers students and teachers through personalized learning. I know, Saul has talked a lot about it. And we believe that education is not one size fits all. Actually, all students are unique. So if we give them and connect them with amazing teachers who are able and capable of personalizing learning to spark their curiosity, the world is really within their reach. Right now, the VIPKid platform connects over 800,000 students with 100,000 teachers in the US and Canada. So that's a little bit about VIPKid.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of how we can work with the government, there's so many ways, and I'm going to start, I don't know how much time I have, but I'm going to start with just what we've been doing during COVID in both China and the United States. And then I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about just in the long run, how we see the private sector can actually support and inform government policy, especially on online education. So when COVID started, and if everyone remembers, it actually, started in China. So that was in January. The company immediately launched a program that donates 1.5 million online classes to students in China because schools were all closed. And we also posted free educational content on China's major streaming services. In addition, we developed our own online education platform that's free for anyone to use. It's called Weimi. Essentially, it's kind of like Zoom or Google Classroom. It's a very useful tool for teachers who need to continue to teach their students. And on the US side, once the schools start to close in the US, we actually work closely with, in particular, California and New York at that time, I would say, probably most severely impacted by the virus, to make sure that our resources can go to support the closing of digital divide. So the governor of California in particular, I'm sure you both know about it, launched a cross-sector partnership to support distance learning and bridge the digital divide initiative. And we're very honored to be part of it because we do recognize that the most critical need at that time for students is really just access to tablets as well as Wi-Fi hotspots. And then on our teacher community side, which is really what we have been focusing on largely in the United States and Canada, since we have 100,000 teachers and tutoring online, a lot of them, through just working on VIPKid, have really accumulated this amazing online tutoring and teaching experience. So they've reached out to grassroots brick and mortar schools to really help their communities, to offer advice in terms of how to teach online. Because if everyone remembers at that time, it was really difficult for brick and mortar schools teachers to transition from offline to online teaching. So in that way, our teachers have been particularly helpful. We also curated free distance learning resources to help teachers to teach online. We recorded videos from how to set up your online classroom, how to engage with your students, to all kinds of, English learning strategies. And we provide those resources as free to education officials throughout the US. So, there's been a lot of things that we're doing, have been doing during COVID. But more importantly, if we want to talk about in terms of, what policies can be in place, I think, the last, I would say, year, 2020, we just seen this uptick of online education, whether it's compelled, forced, however you want to describe it. But what's exciting is what lies ahead in terms of the opportunity. And I think government has a really critical role to play. Some of the examples, I think, Sal has mentioned, definitely the digital divide is the number one thing we need to address. I just saw a report by McKinsey yesterday that, it's kind of a lost year, learning year, the last year. Our students' reading and math has really lagged behind, especially among the minorities, the most disadvantaged communities. And if you look at, more general data, basically, there are about 55 million students learning online in the US, and close to 17 million students don't really have stable access to internet or computers. So, I think the government, FCC in particular, the broadband access, that just needs to happen. The funding needs to go to support public schools in particular, and we do have that funding available. I think that's the number one issue. And number two, is related to, I would say, child privacy issue. I mean, we talk about privacy issues, even for adults, right? That's a top issue for the tech kind of related policy. And the child online protection policy also needs to be enhanced as, more and more edtech products are coming into schools. Almost everyone is learning online. Like, how do we think about those issues? I also think that's really important. And then it comes down to how much screen time do we really want students to have? And what kind of teacher qualifications should we require? Cybersecurity, all these other issues. I think it's going to be a very, very exciting time for us to think about those issues, but we also need to do it right. So we're not going to create the kind of, I would say, unintended consequences that unfortunately, is going to be barrier to online learning.
There I am. I do want to come back to something you touched on in just a second, but I want to turn now to a different context, and that's the Philippines, and go to Clarissa and ask her if she would just say a few words about what Teach for Philippines is about, and then we'll start with that, and then we'll come back to a specific aspect of it that I'd love to talk a bit more about it. But Clarissa, tell us a little bit about Teach for the Philippines.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. And again, wonderful to be here with all three of you. Teach for the Philippines, in a nutshell, has been working for 2 decades now in Philippine public education. Along with my co-founders, we founded Teach for the Philippines to really address the challenge of improving Philippine education quality at scale. I don't mean to go, as you said, Tony, into wonky education speak, but suffice to say that in just the last few years, the Philippines for the first time opened itself up to international exams like the PISA, which is an international standardized assessment across various public school systems, or TIMS, Trends in International Math and Science, or even UNICEF helping Southeast Asia, the CIMEO group, compare our public education systems. And the Philippines has really landed in the bottom, as in 75 out of 75 countries in PISA, 64 out of 64 countries in TIMS. And even the recent Southeast Asia survey showed that essentially only 1% of our, let's say, 10-year-olds in this particular case are at level in reading and math. And PISA follows up from there with 15-year-olds. So it's really no surprise to those of us that have been working at a time. And it's really at a point where it's already an education quality catastrophe, to borrow your words, Sal. And so Teach for the Philippines, which, as Tom mentioned, used to be called Saklat Sisikat, really grew from this organic idea that we focused on reading, but then eventually expanded to, beyond reading, we have a huge education quality challenge in this entire country. How do we help address that at scale without blowing up the whole system? Because the Philippine public school system employs 1 million people and 27 million children. Like, you can't make that disappear overnight. And so we do that in 3 ways with 3 different programs. We address the intake of new teachers because our teacher education itself is challenged. The bottom percentage of our high school students will become teachers. It's the easiest licensure to get and the most stable government job to get. So we challenge the intake by attracting new teachers with either STEM specialties or subject matter competency based, as Sal says, specialties, just putting it in simple terms. And then the second thing we do is we also work with and include already tenured government teachers to ensure that we don't leave them behind, because there are gems that already exist within the system. And how do you bring them up and have their voices be heard, as well as amplify what they already know? And then the third thing we do is we try to bridge the gap between policy makers, decision makers, and what's happening on the ground, because oftentimes there's not just a gap, there's a ravine between the people that make decisions on policy and those that are tasked to implement them. And we do that by channeling former teachers into positions in the government, both local and national, that have to do with education and youth policy. And about 50%, so about 90% of our teachers will do this path, and about 50% of them will stay to take government tenured jobs, and thereby hopefully over time bridging those experiences. Anybody that works in a bureaucracy knows that just the way the bureaucracy is structured, oftentimes it's been decades since those that are making decisions have been inside the classroom, if they've been in the classroom at all, if they're in appointed roles, right? And so how do you address that? Just quickly, in terms of COVID, how has that changed our work? I think the only 2 points I'll bring before turning it back to you, Tony. I mean, again, we do work in some urban cities. About 10% of our teaching happens in urban sites, but the vast majority happens in rural and peri-urban communities, where the families make between $2 to $4 a day, or $100, $200 a month, right? One of the key things that we decided we needed to do quickly was, in spite or despite the lockdowns, the Philippines has among the world's longest lockdowns. We still are in lockdown right now. Is to physically deploy our teachers. While they might not be teaching face-to-face, Sal mentions this in his podcast with Guy Raz, it's really important to nourish and respect the relationship of trust between the children and their teacher. And so even if it's not face-to-face, having them proximate in their community is critical to our work. The second thing we did was we already had worked with parents and guardians before COVID, but because of COVID's impact, we then obviously saw that the role of parents and guardians in this new normal, quote unquote, had expanded, and we needed to expand as well our inclusion and work with them. And as they navigated their changing role in their child's education, we had to help them navigate that. I guess ultimately summing to where and how do you think, I mean, one thing I can think about with policy, and another thing that worries me, that my co-panelists have mentioned before, in terms of policy, I think on a broad scale, even just the mindset shift of thinking about teachers as frontliners, not just for COVID, but like if we're talking about an education calamity, then there are frontliners with that too. In a macro scale, that's resources and infrastructure. In a micro scale, like Teach for the Philippines, we, for example, got all of our teachers private healthcare insurance just for COVID, really just putting it out there that we need to understand that they are our frontline folks in helping us address this. And then I think a worry that Sal mentioned is socio-emotional. So yes, there's the digital divide and being cooped up in your room. But I think in countries like the Philippines and in communities all over the world, not just the Philippines, but also in America, maybe this is inappropriate, but it's like a trauma comorbidity. There are so many intersectional traumas that have happened in our communities. In my particular case, it's generational poverty, not to mention the typhoons that come rolling in and decimating entire communities. One of our communities, 90% of the infrastructure was completely wiped out after 3 successive weeks of the world's strongest storms rolling through. And then understanding how you educate communities that are just repeatedly going through these things, and how do you address that and support them while also, in our case, teaching the fundamental basics of learning, right? How do you address all those things? And like Sal said, it's a very big concern of mine. In Teach for the Philippines, all of our teachers have access to a psychologist, but how do you scale that to 1 million people, right? And then how do you address this going forward? A big question that weighs heavily on my mind. Not just during COVID, but since forever.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to pick up on that, and actually, that's one of the questions that we've just gotten from our colleagues. Is how do we post-pandemic in relation to online learning, but learning generally? But I'll start with online learning, and maybe direct this to Sal to begin with. But the whole panel, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, how do you engage parents thoughtfully in helping to educate their students, particularly? Let's start with in the context of now having so much time online. But I'd be interested in a broader sense of kind of, given the conditions of learning are so varied. I mean, how do you ensure that parents are going to be supportive and helpful, and also their own needs being met? But Sal, let me turn to you to start with that. And what advice do you give to parents as we roll into the pandemic and post-pandemic world?
Yeah, well, at a meta level, in some ways, if there's, we're talking about silver linings of the pandemic, it's that you do have a generation of families that are more involved in their kids' education than ever because they had to be because of the distance learning or the homeschooling. And that is a good thing because I think a lot of families, I would say upper income, middle class families, they realize that even when their kids go to great schools, that they also need to provide a lot of supports on top of it, frankly, so their kids don't accumulate those gaps and they do stay engaged both academically and social emotionally. Well, I think a lot of families assume that, hey, I'll just send my kids to school and good things will happen to them. And then they're surprised when their kids disengage or they fall really behind. So what my message to families and parents is, we're all hoping kids go back, but don't lose that level of engagement to make sure that your kids are really learning. And this doesn't have to be, something that overwhelms you and your family. It literally is, it's a very traditional view, reading, writing, and mathematics. If kids are able to put in, 30 minutes a day, just making sure that they're really mastering their concepts, they're going to progress. The other message I would tell to parents is, there are far more high quality resources that are either free or very low cost than most of them realize today. And you can obviously, things like Khan Academy, get unlimited help with math and science, starting as early as pre-K with Khan Academy Kids. There's many tutoring options in the world that are either free, we're working on schoolhouse.world, or low cost that aren't just tutoring, but also ways for kids to connect with other people in really interesting ways. And so I'm hoping that more families start taking advantage of that. At Khan Academy, one of the main I should say problems we've had. There's tens of millions of folks who use this every month, but there could be hundreds of millions, and it's free. It's available in 46 languages, and we just need to get the word out. And what we've actually found, ironically, outside of some of the more developed countries, outside of the U.S. and Europe, is that people are skeptical of something that's free. They're like, well, surely that other thing's got to be better. But no, we have the efficacy studies, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there's obviously a lot of high quality, low cost things as well that could be really, really good for families that people just don't realize yet.
Mm-hmm. Clarissa or Wenchi, did you want to weigh in on this at all?
Yeah, go ahead, Wenchi.
Wenchi, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I think each country, each society is going to have a little bit different parents in terms of, how they view education. In this case, I can talk a little bit about China, because I do think China can share some lessons learned, especially during COVID. Online education, started, I would say, not earlier in China than, the US. However, it's really, I would say, developed really fast, even before COVID. And what we've noticed is that, the hardest part is that for parents to trust that online education can actually help their kids. And that they can trust the teachers, right? So your online platform essentially needs to bring that trust out. So the most important thing for us, even as a company, is to show that we identify the highest quality teachers who are, criminal background, everything, qualification, etc. It will meet your need. That's when parents are willing to use online education to supplement their, daily, the normal school, regular school hours. So I think, even just in the beginning, that trust in education technology platforms still needs to be built, especially in the US. I see that, there's still debates about whether we should use technology as a platform for education or not. There's just all kinds of worries. And I think we need to build that trust first. Obviously, that also means all kinds of tools that are made available to parents also need to be done in the right way. So unlike, I think higher ed, we've seen that there were some scandals in the past, and I think people kind of lost confidence in higher ed when it comes to online education. I think, we have that lesson learned, and, so K-12 education, let's start in the right place. And, again, I do think government needs to play a role. The government cannot be too hands-off when it comes to K-12 online education, especially teacher qualifications. So, I think I'm going to stop here.
Okay, great. Clarissa, did you want to have the last word on this one?
Sure. I mean, just simply put, in our context, when we did our rapid assessment surveys of our community, 70% of the families experienced a loss in income during COVID. I think looking at the reality of life today with an upcoming recession or already present recession, families are managing so many things. And if you're thinking about a rural or peri-urban communities, the biggest concern the parents always had is, how do I put food on the table and then also be there for our kids? Additionally, so many of the parents that we have with us themselves don't really know how to read or write. And so my simple, contribution to the conversation is that that's really one of the principal reasons that our organization knew that we had to be proximate to our community. We help our parents and their guardians by showing up. And we have been showing up, and where in some rural island communities where there's no community transmission, we've been able to do parent workshops where we are physically face-to-face with proper social distancing, helping and tool parents. A lot of our kids are being raised by their grandparents in the Philippines. So a lot of our parents are out there serving in your hospitals. And so they're being raised by grandparents, and we're just navigating, obviously, a lot of competing priorities, and also just tiredness. And I think that's, again, why I just go back to the social emotional situation, there's weariness in our communities, and we need to show up and show that we're there with them and kind of link arms. We call it gabay sa gabay, which means in English, we are the guide of the guides or the supporter of the supporter, and that's what we call our parent training.
Got it. Yeah.
Carer of the caregivers, if you may.
Yeah. So I assume you would agree with one of the questions that just come through the transom here that teachers should be vaccinated along with other first responders and essential. I mean, I'm not even going to ask whether or not we have any disagreement, but if you somehow disagree, you can certainly say that. But it strikes me that that makes a lot of sense, because just as you're saying, there really is a frontline quality to what teaching is all about right now. So I think it's really important. We had a couple of questions to sort of dive a little bit deeper into this notion of closing the digital divide. I mean, it sounds like just the right sort of thing to do, but how? I mean, is it simply a matter of making sure that everybody has the right hardware and software and connectivity, or is it more to it than that? And from a policy perspective, what exactly would be the means by which we close the digital divide? Sal, I'll come back to you to start again.
Yeah, I think there's multiple layers to it. I talked to the CEO of AT&T a couple of days ago, and what the telecom players are they want to work with government to provide incentives. There's places where it's not, from a for-profit point of view, there's not the ROI to put, to run fiber out to a rural farm or in certain places, or even in urban settings to kind of dig up the streets in certain ways. And so, there needs to be a role for government to provide incentives for folks to do that. I think a lot of the traditional telecom incentives, with the telephone industry, when the telephone was the way to access everything, there were really good programs where they would essentially spread the cost of getting telephone access between high density places where it was easier to get access and low density places, so that everyone could have access to a phone line. Needs to have something similar. There are programs that get rural telephone access. They need to be modernized for internet access. They need to not just think about kind of fixed line. They could think about how do you get high bandwidth cellular, which is constantly evolving. They could think about some of these, low Earth orbiting satellites, SpaceX and Starlink and whatever else is coming out. But I think it's got to be a full court press at looking at all of that. And then, as you mentioned, it's not just about getting the access, providing the incentives or vouchers for people to be able to get it. In fact, I actually think it should be the expectation. If you go into a low-income housing, you assume that there will be heating, you assume that there will be water, you assume that there will be sewage. I think you need to assume that there will be internet access. And on the device side, we're seeing great work by philanthropy and corporations getting low-cost devices out there. I think there probably is a role for government or the school districts to do that. And that whole full-court press has I think a decent shot of closing it, obviously, but it's different everywhere.
Yeah. Clarissa and Wenchi, I'll have you comment on this as well, but I want to just pose a question in relation to that. Are there lessons from Asia we can learn in this regard? Because I must admit, I just don't know what the level of sort of ubiquity of internet access is in other places. So as you think about kind of how you would respond to the question of how do you reduce the digital divide, what lessons from Asia come to mind that would help us in this regard?
Yeah, happy to share that. So rural education is something, obviously a huge challenge, not only in the Philippines, but also in many parts of Asia. So in China, what we're seeing is that many companies actually started investing in rural education, bringing education to rural schools from traditional foundations, nonprofits, government, to more recently, I would say, education technology companies. So one of the, I would say, a very proud innovation that VIPKid has been able to do is to bring teachers and classroom to rural schools. So because everything is online, so we were able to have American teachers teaching live to rural school kids in Inner Mongolia or elsewhere, that they can have access to the high quality and truly innovative, I would say, online education and English learning. And, that rural education project, when we started about 3 years ago, now has grown to reach about 50,000 students. And so, it's something that, as a company, as a philanthropic project, we can do for our social impact work. But, learning from what we've been doing in the China side, we're also bringing that to the United States. Actually, one program, and I want to come back to the teacher side, is how important it is to help develop teachers' online education skills. Before COVID, I think, very few people probably would think about investing in programs that would really support professional development for online tutors. But we already recognize that because in our business, we just see there's a shortage actually of skilled online educators. So we, started a nonprofit, it's called VIPKid, that focuses on developing online educators' skills. So the first fellowship program was launched just over the summer. So we give them access to not only sort of digital learning experience and mentoring and other sort of professional development opportunity, but also giving them access to teach online to rural kids in China. So they have this kind of intercultural direct experience. And it's not one-to-one, it's one-to-many. So it's a classroom setting. I think, all these things can be done, and we would love to do more to close the digital gap. A lot of innovations just need to and will happen.
You need to go to scale. Yeah. Clarissa.
Not much more to add other from Wenchi's and Sal's brilliant points. I think just from the Philippine perspective, or let's say a smaller low to middle income country perspective, I truly believe that education quality, in addition to education access, needs to be a whole country priority. This is not something that just the Ministry of Education or concerned parents or concerned service delivery organizations like my own can solve on our own. We have a lot of islands without even basic electricity, right? Rotational electricity. We need the deep understanding that education reform and higher quality education has economic impact, and it needs to be a whole country, whole government priority across all branches of government and across all departments, and it needs to be addressed as in unison, right? And so I think that's a little bit what both Wenchi and Sal were saying, and I'm just saying it's no different here. Not in the Philippines, and definitely most likely looks similar to you in America.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And other places.
Yeah, that's terrific. So let me pose a question that I'm gonna take it to a slightly different place, because I want to talk a little bit about kind of the whole phenomenon of how much time young people are spending online or engaged in sort of digitally based interactions. I was looking at some results from the 2018 PISA that just came out, and it said that across all of the OECD countries, the time that young people spend on online has increased between 2012 and 2018 by an hour per student per day, and so that the average now in terms of spending time online out of school is 3 hours per day per student, and even more on weekends. And so that's in addition to whatever they're doing in school online. And Andreas Schleicher, who is the head of the PISA branch of OECD, he wrote this. He said, "The smartphone has transformed the ways in which people read and exchange information. In the past, students could find clear and often singular answers to their questions in carefully curated and government-approved textbooks, and they could generally trust those answers to be true. Today, they will find hundreds of thousands of answers to their questions online, and it's up to them to figure out what is true and what is false, and what is right and what is wrong. The speed and volume and reach of information flows in the current digital ecosystem have created the perfect conditions for fake news to thrive. Assertions that feel right or but have no basis in fact have become accepted as truth. Algorithms that sort people into groups of like-minded individuals create social media echo chambers that amplifies views and leave individuals uninformed of and insulated from opposing arguments that may alter their own beliefs. My question really simply is, does that worry you? And if so, what can we do about that? Sal, I'll let you have the first word on this last question. What do you think, Sal?
It worries me incredibly. I think there's two issues here. There's just like the sheer quantity of screen time and then what might be getting lost. And then there's the issue of polarization and folks getting into their bubbles because of social media, or not having knowing what information is real or not. On the sheer access to screen time, I think of screen time as a neutral. It can be very positive. It can be very negative. What matters more is, what makes sure that kids are having socialization. They're running outside. They're eating well. They're having time with family. One of the biggest predictors of success is having dinner with your family and sleeping fully. So those two things need to be happening. Mm-hmm. And then what's happening in that screen time? There could be, if my children are spending time writing a paper, if they are producing a fun, creative video, if they are writing computer code, if they are on Khan Academy, if they are on Schoolhouse or with their teachers on a video conference interacting, that broadly speaking is good screen time. Once again, as long as they're not losing the playing outside, time with their family, motor skill development, socialization. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's okay. The bad screen time is obviously, or the bad to neutral, we all need to chill out. I've watched some stuff that I wouldn't want to share with you all every now and then. We all need a little bit of that, but obviously they can go to extremes. And then to the second part of the question, that can be bad when you get into these rabbit holes of misinformation or being just in your bubble. I have to say, I do strongly sympathize with the people who are trying to wrestle with this, because even myself, I've gone back and forth between, do you regulate it? But how do you regulate it in a way that doesn't do weird things to speech? And mm-hmm. It probably won't get you around the problem because everything is moving so fast. Mm-hmm. So it's a tough situation on that front. And as you mentioned, it's not just kids. In fact, if anything, I think we adults are doing a much worse job getting polarized.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We've got echo chambers with guardrails on them. So yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks a ton. Clarissa or Wenchi, did you want to come in on this?
I'm love to talk about this issue because it's so important. I think this is where businesses can play a big role, right? So there's a lot of parental control features that can be built into those functions. And that really, needs businesses to do that voluntarily and initiate, especially for, I would say, kids that are younger than maybe the age of, 12 or 13. So that can certainly be controlled in terms of how much time and what they are doing online. Like Sal said, I completely agree. Let's say if you say kids spend 2 hours or 3 hours online, what are they doing there? If they're doing it for more productive learning, that's good online screen time. And, once that time is over, get them out to do other activities instead of, playing games or, that are things maybe less constructive to kids' healthy development. And in terms of misinformation, again, depends on, kids' age. Parental control is important. But in the meantime, I do think businesses need to think about their responsibility when it comes to content moderation. I know it's a huge debate. Much more than just online education for kids. But, businesses really need to take the responsibility. And in some way, our company is, doesn't have to address that issue because it's not an open platform.
Right.
It's not like people just comment, randomly, but we do moderate what's being discussed online because we're teaching young kids. So what can teachers say or not? Certain behavior, it just needs to have the right policies in place. So, everything that's happening online, especially for younger kids' education, is considered appropriate. Like,
Right.
What would you consider is appropriate taking place in the actual classroom?
Right.
I think that trust needs to be built.
Yeah. Clarissa, I'm going to give you the last word on this because we're just about out of time.
Sure. The only thing I'd say, I would just expand on Wenchi's point. I think in an age where so before the technological revolution, knowledge was really shared by individuals and institutions that had, quote unquote, earned the right to share them, right? Had gone through the paces to then be able to write an opinion column or become a news anchor, speaking to you, Tom, your profession, right, in the media. I think as we've democratized this ability to share content, it goes beyond big private enterprise and government. And I think this is where even the role of media and the responsibility that traditional media and those institutions have shifted slightly to now having to check themselves and be self-responsible for the content that they share in a world where everybody is sharing content. How has their role shifted? They're not just one of many voices. They need to stand out there and show approve that their content and their commitment to their craft is at par with all the other industries that are shifting themselves. And I think there are countries where this has been done and can be done. I think of Eastern Europe. They have noontime shows where they break down fake news versus real news channels themselves.
Interesting. Wow.
And they're just far ahead of the game in addressing that openly, transparently, and helping the public also would be more conscious about where they're getting content and sharing in that responsibility, if this makes any sense, Tony.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. And I think we could certainly use some of that sort of helping us understand what's fake and what's not. But with that, though, I'm going to thank my panel profusely. You guys were fantastic. It was really, really exciting to be able to listen to your really thoughtful comments. I appreciate it so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom. And Tom, take it away. But thank you so much.
Yeah, huge thanks to you, Tony. Great job moderating. That last question you asked, frankly, could have been an hour conversation in its own right. And actually, it's one we've had before, but it to be continued. So thanks to you, Sal Khan, inspiring and great as always. You're very generous with your time. And Wenchi Yu, Clarissa Delgado, you are, as always, great representatives and really ambassadors for the Asia 21 network. So we appreciate your time and your inputs as well. Coming up next at this virtual summit of the Asia 21 Young Leaders Network in a moment. Again, the headline for this whole thing is Life After the Pandemic. And we tackle next arts and culture after the pandemic. The global head of arts and culture for the Asia Society will be with us, leading another great group of representatives and alumni from the Asia 21 network. So thank you all again. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to the audience, and stay tuned.